the United States appears to be standing on the edge of a dramatic military decision. Signs from Washington, troop movements in the region, and rising diplomatic tension all suggest that a strike against Iran could happen within days rather than weeks. Analysts can make educated guesses about what the initial targets would be: Revolutionary Guard bases, missile depots, radar installations, command centers, and possibly sensitive nuclear facilities. Yet predicting the aftermath is far more complicated. History shows that wars rarely unfold according to neat plans or political expectations. Once the first missiles are launched, control quickly slips away from decision makers. What follows is often shaped by fear, retaliation, chaos, and unintended consequences. To understand what could happen next, experts have outlined several possible outcomes, ranging from hopeful political change to catastrophic regional collapse. Each scenario carries its own risks, opportunities, and dangers. The first scenario is the most optimistic and, according to many observers, the least likely. In this version, the United States conducts highly precise, surgical strikes aimed at minimizing civilian casualties while targeting key Revolutionary Guard leadership and strategic military infrastructure. The goal would be to weaken the regime so severely that it collapses internally. Supporters of this idea imagine a brief period of instability, followed by a transitional government and eventually democratic elections. In theory, Iran would emerge as a reformed state, reintegrated into the global economy and diplomatic community. However, history casts a long shadow over such hopes. Western military interventions in the Middle East rarely produce smooth transitions. Instead of stability, they often leave power vacuums, fractured societies, and long-lasting instability. While the idea is attractive on paper, reality suggests a far messier outcome. Looking at past interventions offers sobering lessons. Iraq, Libya, and Syria were all targeted with promises of liberation and stability. Yet in each case, the collapse of centralized power unleashed waves of violence, extremism, and humanitarian disaster. Institutions were weakened, borders became porous, and armed groups filled the vacuum. Iran is far larger, more complex, and more politically entrenched than any of those examples. The Islamic Republic has spent decades building parallel power structures, loyal militias, and security networks designed to survive pressure. Removing the leadership would not automatically dismantle these systems. Instead, it could ignite internal struggles for power. This makes the idea of a clean democratic transition extremely uncertain. While some opposition figures abroad speak of readiness to govern, the realities on the ground suggest that rebuilding political order would be extraordinarily difficult and potentially violent. Some supporters of regime change point to exiled political figures as potential transitional leaders. They argue that a caretaker government could guide Iran through reforms before elections are held. In theory, this would provide stability while avoiding long-term foreign occupation. Yet such plans often underestimate the complexity of Iranian society and politics. Internal factions, regional identities, and ideological divisions would not disappear overnight. Additionally, foreign-backed leadership can easily be perceived as illegitimate by the population. Without broad internal support, such governments struggle to maintain authority. Even with international recognition, they often lack the power to control armed groups or enforce laws. While the idea of peaceful political transformation is appealing, it requires conditions that are rarely present after military conflict. For many analysts, this makes the first scenario more hopeful fantasy than realistic outcome. The second scenario is more restrained and perhaps more plausible. In this version, the Iranian regime survives the initial strikes, but emerges weakened and under immense pressure. With US military forces surrounding the region and advanced weapon systems deployed nearby, Iran would be forced into a defensive posture. Its leadership might choose to reduce confrontational behavior, limit regional proxy activities, and pursue diplomatic survival rather than ideological expansion. Some analysts compare this to the Venezuelan model, a government that remains in place but loses much of its influence, legitimacy, and freedom of action. Under this scenario, Iran would still exist as a centralized state, but one constrained by economic isolation, military vulnerability, and political pressure. While this avoids total collapse, it does not guarantee peace. This outcome would likely reshape Iran's foreign policy priorities. Instead of projecting power through allied militias in the region, Tehran might focus on preserving internal control and economic survival. Sanctions pressure, combined with military losses, could push leaders toward negotiations. However, there is also the possibility that the regime becomes more repressive domestically in response to external threats. Historically, governments under siege often tighten internal security rather than liberalize. Citizens may face increased surveillance, restricted freedoms, and harsher crackdowns on dissent. While the state survives, society pays the price. International observers would be forced to decide whether containment and deterrence are preferable to direct confrontation. This scenario avoids full-scale war, but it still leaves Iran isolated, unstable, and politically tense. The third scenario involves a collapse of civilian leadership followed by a military takeover. In Iran's case, this would almost certainly not involve the conventional army. Real power lies with the Revolutionary Guard Corps and associated militia networks. These forces are deeply embedded in Iran's economy, politics, and security apparatus. If the political leadership fell, these groups would likely step in to preserve order and protect their interests. Such a takeover would not represent democratic reform. Instead, it would shift authority from clerical leadership to military command. While this might restore short-term stability, it would create a heavily militarized state. Protesters seeking political freedom would likely find themselves facing even harsher control. For foreign governments, this outcome would be problematic, as it replaces ideological leadership with hardened military elites. A military-led Iran would likely prioritize national security and internal control above all else. Civil liberties would be reduced, political opposition suppressed, and dissent treated as a threat to national survival. Economically, such a government might struggle to attract international investment or rebuild trade relationships. Militarized governance often leads to corruption, inefficiency, and isolation. While this scenario avoids immediate chaos, it creates long-term instability by freezing political development. It also risks turning Iran into a permanently sanctioned and heavily armed state, locked in constant tension with regional rivals. For the United States and its allies, this outcome would be deeply unsatisfying. The original objectives of reform and stability would remain unfulfilled, while the region continues to face security risks. The fourth scenario involves direct retaliation by Iran. Iranian leaders have repeatedly warned that any attack would not go unanswered. The country possesses a large missile arsenal capable of striking U.S. bases across the Middle East. American installations in Qatar, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and the United Arab Emirates would become immediate targets. Israel could also be drawn into the conflict. While US and allied air defense systems are advanced, no defense network is perfect. Even a small percentage of missiles getting through could cause serious damage. Military casualties, infrastructure destruction, and regional panic would likely follow. This would escalate the conflict beyond a limited strike and transform it into a broader regional confrontation. Such retaliation would dramatically raise the stakes. Once blood is spilled on multiple sides, political pressure for further action increases. Leaders would face domestic demands to respond forcefully. Each strike would provoke counterstrikes, creating a dangerous cycle of escalation. Civilian populations near military bases could be affected by secondary explosions, falling debris, or accidental targeting. Regional governments would struggle to balance alliance obligations with public safety. The Middle East is already saturated with tensions, unresolved conflicts, and fragile alliances. Adding direct US-Syrian combat to this environment could destabilize multiple countries simultaneously. Even nations attempting to remain neutral would feel the economic and security consequences of such widespread military activity. The fifth scenario focuses on global economic disruption. Iran could attempt to block or disrupt shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most critical maritime choke points in the world. Nearly a quarter of global oil and gas shipments pass through this narrow corridor each year. By deploying naval mines, fast boats, and disguised civilian vessels, Iran could make commercial shipping extremely dangerous. Even limited disruption would cause oil prices to surge and trigger global economic instability. Insurance costs for shipping would skyrocket, and energy markets would react immediately. This tactic would hurt Iran economically as well, but in moments of desperation, strategic self-harm becomes a political weapon. There is historical precedent for this strategy. During the Iran-Iraq tanker war of the 1980s, naval mines severely disrupted shipping and forced international intervention. Clearing mines is slow, dangerous, and risky. intensive. Even rumors of mining operations can halt commercial traffic. Modern economies are deeply dependent on stable energy flows. A prolonged disruption in Hormuz would affect everything from fuel prices to food supply chains. China, Europe, and developing economies would all feel the impact. While this move would damage Iran's own export capabilities, it could be used as leverage to pressure global powers into demanding de-escalation. However, it risks drawing even more foreign naval forces into the region. The sixth scenario involves asymmetric warfare at sea. Iran has invested heavily in swarm tactics, using large numbers of small boats, drones, and missiles to overwhelm advanced naval defenses. Instead of engaging U.S. warships directly, Iran would attempt to saturate defense systems with multiple simultaneous attacks. Even heavily protected aircraft carriers rely on layered defense systems that can be strained under sustained pressure. A successful strike that damages or sinks a U.S. vessel would represent a major symbolic victory for Iran. The psychological impact would be enormous. It would demonstrate vulnerability in even the most advanced military platforms and reshape public perception of naval dominance. The capture of U.S. personnel would further escalate the crisis. Images of detained sailors or pilots would spread rapidly across global media. Political pressure inside the United States would intensify dramatically. Historical memory of past hostage crises still shapes public sentiment. Any such event would limit diplomatic flexibility and push leaders toward more aggressive military responses. What begins as limited retaliation could transform into full-scale war. This scenario represents one of the most dangerous escalation pathways, where symbolic humiliation and national pride override strategic restraint. Once this threshold is crossed, stepping back becomes politically difficult for both sides. The seventh scenario is the most frightening for regional governments. It involves the collapse of centralized authority, followed by internal fragmentation. Iran is home to diverse ethnic and regional communities, including Kurds, Azeris, Arabs, and Baluch populations. Under strong central control, these tensions are contained. If the government collapses suddenly, suppressed grievances could resurface violently. Armed groups might form along ethnic or regional lines. Local power struggles could erupt. Weapons depots could be looted. Rival factions would attempt to control territory. What follows would resemble the worst outcomes seen in other collapsed states. This fragmentation would generate massive humanitarian consequences. Millions of civilians could be displaced internally or forced to flee across borders. Neighboring countries would face refugee flows they are unprepared to manage. Aid organizations would struggle to operate in insecure environments. Food shortages, medical crises, and infrastructure collapse would quickly follow. Such instability would not remain confined to Iran. Border regions would become insecure, smuggling networks would expand, and extremist groups could exploit the chaos. This scenario represents the nightmare outcome for the region: prolonged instability without clear resolution. Regional powers such as Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE are deeply concerned about this possibility. While they oppose Iranian influence, they also fear uncontrolled collapse more than continued rivalry. A fractured Iran would export instability rather than contain it. Economic ties, energy markets, and regional security arrangements would all suffer. For Gulf states, stability is essential for long-term development and investment. This is why many leaders quietly urge caution, even while publicly supporting pressure on Tehran. They understand that starting a war is easy compared to managing its consequences. From a strategic perspective, the greatest danger lies in miscalculation. Political leaders often assume they can control escalation. History suggests otherwise. Once military action begins, unexpected events drive decisions. Accidental casualties, misinterpreted signals, and emotional public reactions shape policy faster than careful planning. Each side becomes locked into a cycle of retaliation. The original objectives become secondary to immediate survival and political image management. What starts as a limited strike can rapidly become a regional war. Another key factor is domestic political pressure. Leaders face expectations to appear strong. Backing down after mobilizing forces is often seen as weakness. This psychological dynamic pushes decision-makers toward action even when strategic clarity is lacking. Saving political face becomes more important than achieving realistic outcomes. This creates a dangerous environment where symbolic gestures override long-term planning. The result is often prolonged conflict without clear exit strategies. The international community would struggle to contain such a crisis. Diplomacy becomes harder once missiles are flying. Trust erodes quickly. Even allies may disagree on escalation limits. Global institutions are often slow to respond to rapidly unfolding military events. Meanwhile, financial markets react instantly, amplifying economic consequences. The interconnected nature of today's world means no major conflict remains isolated. What happens in the Gulf affects households across continents. Media coverage would further intensify the situation. Graphic images, emotional reporting, and social media amplification create pressure for immediate responses. Public opinion shifts rapidly, often driven by incomplete information. Leaders must navigate not only military strategy, but also information warfare. Narratives become weapons. Perception matters as much as battlefield reality. This psychological dimension adds another layer of complexity to an already volatile situation. Long-term consequences would extend far beyond the battlefield. Regional alliances could shift. Defense spending would rise. Arms races could intensify. Diplomatic relationships would be reshaped for decades. Even if active fighting ends quickly, distrust would remain. Reconstruction would require enormous resources. Political scars would persist across generations. This highlights why preventive diplomacy is always preferable to military solutions, even when tensions seem unavoidable. Energy security would remain a central concern. Global dependence on Middle Eastern oil means that any prolonged instability creates ripple effects worldwide. Developing nations suffer most from price spikes. Transportation costs rise. Inflation increases. Economic inequality deepens. These indirect consequences often harm far more people than the conflict itself. War reshapes everyday life for millions who never see the battlefield. Human cost remains the most tragic element. Civilian casualties, displaced families, and lost generations define the real price of conflict. Infrastructure damage affects hospitals, schools, and water systems. Recovery takes decades. Even after peace agreements are signed, societies struggle to heal from trauma. These realities are often invisible in strategic discussions, but remain the most important outcome. Military power can destroy infrastructure quickly, but rebuilding trust and governance takes far longer. Political solutions require patience, compromise, and sustained international engagement. Without these elements, military victories remain hollow. History repeatedly shows that lasting peace cannot be achieved through force alone. For policymakers, the challenge lies in balancing deterrence with restraint. Demonstrating strength without triggering escalation requires careful calibration. Communication channels must remain open even during crisis. Misunderstandings can turn manageable tensions into disasters. Maintaining dialogue is often criticized as weakness, but it is essential for preventing catastrophe. Public awareness also plays a role. Citizens who understand the complexity of conflict are less likely to support simplistic solutions. Responsible media coverage and informed discussion help reduce emotional decision-making. Democracies depend on public engagement to guide policy responsibly. Ultimately, the future remains uncertain. Each scenario carries different risks and consequences. None offer easy solutions. The choices made in the coming days and weeks could shape the Middle East for generations. This is not just about geopolitics. It is about human lives, regional stability, and global security. The world stands at a crossroads. Escalation leads toward unpredictable outcomes. Restraint requires political courage. Both paths carry costs. The challenge is choosing the one that minimizes long-term suffering while preserving international stability. As history has shown repeatedly, starting a war is far easier than ending one. Once forces are mobilized and pride is involved, turning back becomes difficult. The real test of leadership is not how power is displayed, but how wisely it is restrained. What happens next will not only define relations between the United States and Iran, but also shape the future security of the entire region and beyond.